Well, at least 32 social justice movements are calling for the national eviction moratorium to be extended. Now, organizations say lifting the suspension will result in vulnerable people being evicted. They are calling on the presidency and the National Command Council to extend the moratorium. That's until the state produces a sustainable solution to mass foreclosures and evictions. Well, Mpho Rabiane joins us now. She's an attorney at the Ndifuna Ukwazi Law Centre. Mpho, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. So as it stands at the moment, the concern was that if the state of the nation disaster is lifted, it will then make it possible to have those evictions continue. And there are sites across the country with occupations. Those living in Cape Town will probably very much publicised. What is the current law around evictions now?
Hi, Devin, and thanks for having me. Currently, as the Disaster Management Act regulations have been suspended with the lifting of the national state of disaster, the laws in place are the PI Act, that is the Prevention of Illegal Evictions and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act. And under that act, there are procedural protections in place to ensure that no one is evicted, firstly, without an order of the court, and that such court is enjoined to consider all relevant circumstances before ordering an eviction. And such eviction can only be ordered in the circumstances where it is just and equitable for such an order to be executed.
All right.
So
now,
currently, as it stands.
Apologies for going in there, but I see your group and others are concerned by what you say is continuing illegal evictions under that law and demolitions carried out by government. This is happening at the moment.
This is correct. So our main concern and what has been observed throughout lockdown is that such laws are actually not observed, not by state actors and not by private actors equally. So our concern is that illegal evictions will continue to happen should no effective preventative eviction prevention policies be in place. That is why it is a state imperative to ensure that, firstly, those who find themselves tenure insecure as a result of the pandemic, those who find themselves without a stable income also as a result of the pandemic, are not burdened with the additional weight of having to deal with the societal factors that will include or lead to homelessness in a situation where the state has made no provision for their protection and no provision for alternative accommodation in instances where people will find themselves on the street. Looking at our economic status, for instance, many families find themselves without breadwinners. We know that at the height of lockdown, almost 2.2 million people lost their jobs. We're now sitting in a situation where, under the expanded definition, we have 46.6% unemployment. So with those types of figures, there's no way that households are economically able, firstly, to shoulder the crushing debt that they face coming out of the pandemic, and secondly, to ensure that they can pay for sustainable housing. And this would apply to both tenants as well as those who are still paying off their mortgages to their banks.
Let's talk about those who have made these makeshift structures and tented camps that's been erected. We saw some of those visuals in some of the municipalities throughout Cape Town, for example. How do we respond to that? Because that in itself can produce health hazards. I mean, you've got an argument from the municipalities on that front, don't you?
That is correct, that where no measures in line with provision of basic services and ensuring that hygiene is observed, where those measures are not in place, such conditions of squalor will result in health hazards. The issue is that the state and other private actors have not made provision to support those who find themselves with no alternative. The reality throughout the pandemic has been that with jobs being lost, with tenure insecurity and income insecurity rising, with the incidence of food insecurity as well, people have had to make very difficult decisions. And such decisions are keeping a roof over one's head and making sure that your family is fed. Now, in a situation where majority of the people are landless, and in a situation where no real distributive efforts or land reform efforts have addressed the chronic land hunger and inadequate access to adequate housing as provided for in the Constitution. In those conditions, we cannot expect people to do anything else but eke out an existence for themselves and their family, which includes finding a plot of land or even a place on the street to build a rudimentary structure to call their home. Effectively, they have nothing else. The issue that we face at this point is that municipalities predominantly are now leading an assault on the poor. They are enforcing bylaws and regulations to firstly criminalize the act of being poor, that is not being able to afford sustainable accommodation. And secondly, they are instituting measures to allow for law enforcement agencies to summarily demolish one's home without going through the proper procedures provided for in our eviction legislation.
If I could just come in there very quickly before I round up there, Paul. I mean, how do you reconcile that with the fact that many people would say you do have a slide in respect for the law when it comes to some of those instances around the municipalities, for example? I mean, it has to be some sort of a balancing move, some would argue. How do you maintain that very quickly in a few seconds while I have it?
So what needs to happen at this point is where we are to follow the rule of law, and in this case, most poignantly, the PI Act, we have to follow the procedural protections provided for in that act. And that includes the constitutional obligation of municipalities to provide alternative accommodation in instances where evictions will result in homelessness. Now, we are facing a situation where majority of people have nowhere else to go, and necessarily any eviction would lead to homelessness. Okay. Now, the municipality cannot plead abidance of the law and at the same time plead that they have no alternative accommodation, where as a result of the pandemic, we are standing with empty office blocks, we are standing with vacant and underutilized buildings, we are standing with state properties that are vacant and underutilized. And under the existing laws should have been provided for basic services like housing to ensure that the Section 26(2) obligation to provide access to adequate housing is fulfilled. The municipality
we're going to have to leave it there because of time. Fair enough. We get the point, though. Mpho Rabuyane is an attorney at Ndifuna Ukwazi Law Center, talking to us about writing to the president on the moratorium of evictions. Thanks very much indeed.